Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some malicious compliance stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who wrote rules without thinking about loopholes and paid the price. One involves a community cat who became a neighborhood legend, another a bank teller who stopped donating unpaid labor, and the last a wedding party that learned "you can't touch us" is a challenge, not a shield. My HOA tried to leash our community cat. We've lived in our neighborhood for over a decade, and in that entire time, I could count on one hand the number of stray cats I'd seen more than once. Between coyotes, hawks, and the occasional owl that treats the cul-de-sac like a buffet line, outdoor cats don't last long around here. So when a skinny gray tomcat started showing up outside our living room window last year and chatting through the glass with our indoor cat, I assumed it'd be a one-week cameo at best. At first, it was adorable. Our cat would sit on the windowsill and chirp, and this dusty blue-gray stray would answer back like they were gossiping about the neighborhood dogs. But every time I cracked the door, he bolted like I'd pulled out a vacuum cleaner. I figured that was that. Except it wasn't. He came back the next day and the next and the next. After about a month of daily visits, he did something none of the other strays had ever done. He just walked in, like he paid the mortgage. My wife found him sniffing around in the kitchen, looking completely at ease, as if he'd been there his whole life. She scooped him up, declared, "Well, we can't just ignore this," and drove him to the Humane Society, assuming he'd be put up for adoption. Instead, they told us about their community cat program. They neutered him, vaccinated him, clipped his ear to mark him as fixed, and told us to release him back where we'd found him. We drove him home, opened the carrier, and half expected him to give us a dirty look and disappear forever. After all, we'd effectively kidnapped him and removed his manhood. Instead, he trotted back inside that evening like nothing had happened. We named him Blue, mostly because of his smoky coat and partly because it felt wrong to call him that guy forever. Blue developed a routine: come inside during the day, snuggle with our dogs and resident cat, nap on the couch like he owned it, and then head out at night to do whatever mysterious cat business required his attention. When we walked the dogs, he'd materialize out of nowhere and trail behind us, tail up like he was part of the pack. Neighbors would stop and laugh. "Is that your cat?" they'd ask. "We're more like roommates," I'd reply. Most people found it charming. The HOA did not. One afternoon, we got a letter claiming Blue was our pet and that we were violating neighborhood rules by allowing him outside unsupervised. I called the number listed and explained that Blue was technically a community cat, fixed and registered through the Humane Society. The woman on the other end of the line was unimpressed. "If he's coming into your house," she said, "he's your responsibility." So we adjusted. We started keeping Blue inside and only letting him out on supervised walks with the dogs. It mostly worked, except Blue has the energy of a toddler who drank espresso. If he didn't get enough outdoor time, he'd shred furniture, launch himself off bookshelves, and generally redecorate the house with chaos. Then came the bird complaints. A couple of neighbors noticed fewer chirping families in the hedge and decided Blue was the avian Grim Reaper. More letters, more HOA grumbling. Eventually, the board proposed a new rule: all pets must be leashed when outdoors. Not just dogs, all pets. The neighborhood email thread turned into comedy hour. People joked about leashing turtles, ferrets, and guinea pigs. One guy asked if his goldfish needed a harness before being taken to the pond. Despite the pushback, the board passed the rule anyway. When I read the finalized wording, I had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It stated that all pets must be on a leash while outdoors. It did not specify leash length. It did not state that the leash had to be held. It did not say anything about active restraint. I looked at my wife. She looked at me. We both started smiling. That's the moment they wrote a rule and forgot to write the enforcement. You didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't organize a petition. You just read the words they gave you and found a gap. Blue was about to become a loophole on legs. The next day, we bought Blue the shortest, most ridiculous leash we could find. It was barely longer than his body. We clipped it to his harness and let him step outside. He strutted down the sidewalk, dragging this tiny leash behind him like he was walking a fashion accessory. Technically compliant, completely useless. The HOA couldn't say a word. He was leashed. The rule didn't require me to hold it, so I didn't. I simply followed him at a reasonable distance while he paraded around like a celebrity being trailed by paparazzi. Neighbors started taking pictures. Someone posted a video online. Blue dragging his comically short leash while confidently escorting two dogs down the street became something of a neighborhood legend. The more the HOA glared, the more the rest of the block cheered him on. To add a little seasoning to the situation, I reached out to the Humane Society and told them about the leash rule. They thought it was hilarious and mildly infuriating. A week later, their social media team showed up with cameras. They filmed Blue trotting around with his miniature leash, interviewed us about community CAP programs, and gently highlighted the absurdity of applying dog-centric rules to a fixed outdoor cat. The video blew up locally. Comments ranged from "protect this cat at all costs" to "I need that leash for my houseplants." The HOA has been suspiciously quiet ever since. Blue still splits his time between couch naps and neighborhood patrols. He drags his tiny leash with confidence, occasionally pausing to stare down squirrels like he's contemplating a career change. The birds have mostly adapted, and the neighbors who once complained now just shake their heads and laugh. If the board wanted a perfectly controlled, silent little subdivision, they probably didn't anticipate being outmaneuvered by a neutered stray with a 3-foot leash. Blue doesn't care about bylaws. He doesn't care about committees. He cares about sun patches and snacks. And every time he prances past the HOA president's house, leash bouncing behind him, I can't help but admire his commitment to compliance with a side of sass. And our second story. My manager told me to stop coming in early and clocking in. I used to work as a teller at a small regional bank branch tucked into a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid steadily and the commute was unbeatable. I could leave my house at 6:55, walk 5 miles, and see the bank sign glowing in the morning light before most people had even poured their first cup of coffee. Because I lived so close, I was almost always the first one there. Officially, we were scheduled for 7:15 a.m. so we could open the doors to customers at 7:30. Unofficially, the managers liked to be in by 7, so we had enough time to log into our systems, count and fill our cash drawers, run reports, and hold a quick morning meeting. Opening required at least 2 people for security reasons, so if one manager showed up early, they needed someone else there too. That someone was usually me. I didn't mind. I'd show up around 7, the manager would unlock the doors, and we'd start setting up. I'd clock in once I was inside and getting to work, because that's what you do when you're working. It never occurred to me that this was going to become an issue. A few months in, I got called into the office. My branch manager and the assistant manager were sitting there with printouts. The branch manager slid the paper toward me and said, "We need to talk about your time punches." I blinked. "Okay." "There's only a 6-minute grace period for clocking in early or late," she said. "You've clocked in early too many times. Corporate flagged it. We're going to have to adjust about 2 weeks of your punches." I stared at her. "Adjust them how?" "To your scheduled time." In other words, unpaid. I let that sink in for a moment. I'd been coming in early at their request so we could open on time and follow security procedures properly. I wasn't sneaking in to milk the clock. I was literally doing the job they expected me to do. I asked very calmly, "So just to be clear, are you specifically telling me to stop showing up early?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, we are." "Okay," I said, "understood." And I meant it. They told you exactly what they wanted, no more early arrivals, so you gave them exactly that. The irony is, they thought they were fixing a payroll problem. What they actually did was remove the unpaid labor that kept their mornings from falling apart. Sometimes the best way to show your value is to temporarily remove it. The next morning, I left my house at 7:15. I walked at a leisurely pace. I didn't rush. I didn't try to be helpful. I arrived at exactly 7:20, which was well within the 6-minute grace period, and stood outside until someone else with a key got there. The first day, the manager opened the door looking slightly flustered. "Oh, good, you're here," she said. "We're behind." "Am I?" I replied, checking my watch. "I'm within the grace period." I clocked in at 7:21 and went straight to my station without helping fill drawers or prep paperwork. The rhythm of the branch changed immediately. The other tellers didn't care about procedures. They cared about their own drawers and not getting shorted at the end of the day. Without someone there early helping organize things, mornings turned chaotic. We were scrambling to log in, count cash, and answer emails while customers were already pulling on the locked front door. I also discovered something interesting about that 6-minute grace period. It worked both ways. So instead of arriving at 7:15 on the dot, I consistently arrived at 7:20 or 7:21, technically within policy, technically compliant. If we closed at 5 and I had to stay until 5:15 balancing, I made sure my punches reflected every minute. No more casual generosity with my time. Within a couple of weeks, the tension was obvious. Mornings felt frantic. The manager who'd been so firm about policy was now snapping at everyone about being behind schedule. No one connected the dots out loud, but it was pretty clear what had changed. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks into this new routine, the assistant manager approached me. "Hey," she said carefully, "can you come in early tomorrow? We have to do the monthly alarm test." The alarm test was a whole production. We had to trigger different systems, verify silent alarms, call central monitoring, log everything properly. It had to be done before opening, and for nearly a year, I'd been the one helping with it. I looked at her for a second. "What time?" 7, she said. "We need to start right at 7. I nodded. "Sure, no problem." The next morning, I walked in at 6:58. The manager unlocked the door, and I stepped inside. I clocked in immediately at 7 on the dot. Not 6:59, not 6:57, exactly 7 o'clock. We ran the alarm test efficiently. I followed every step by the book. We finished with just enough time to prep our drawers before 7:30. Later that week, I noticed something interesting. My punches were no longer being adjusted. No one mentioned early clock-ins again. No more speeches about grace periods. It was as if the policy had quietly softened once it became inconvenient for management. What really struck me was how backwards the whole situation felt. I'd been trying to make the branch run smoothly. I lived 5 minutes away. Showing up early cost me nothing but benefited everyone. Yet, instead of recognizing that effort, they treated it like I was trying to cheat the system. So I stopped giving away free efficiency. After that, I was strictly by the book. If they needed me early, I clocked in early. If they wanted me to stay late, I clocked out when the job was done and made sure it was recorded. I still did my job well, but I no longer volunteered unpaid minutes to keep things running. Funny enough, the branch eventually went back to functioning smoothly, but it required management to realize that if you want people to show up early and handle responsibilities, you have to actually pay them for that time. It's strange how quickly team player turns into time thief when someone higher-up's looking at a spreadsheet. After that experience, I learned something valuable. If you're going to insist on strict policy, don't be surprised when someone follows it exactly. And our last story. Rich guests vandalized our venue and bragged, "You can't touch us." When I was in my early 20s, I worked at what can only be described as a small palace disguised as a wedding venue. It was an old manor house set deep in parkland and woods, the kind of place with long gravel drives, creaky staircases, oil paintings of ancestors who all looked mildly disappointed, and gardens that seemed to stretch forever. The actual owners only lived in a small wing of the estate because the upkeep was astronomical, so most of the building and grounds were rented out for weddings, corporate retreats, and the occasional over-the-top birthday party. It was stunning, but inconvenient. Public transport barely came within a few miles, so almost every guest arrived by car. That detail is important. My job was essentially do whatever needs doing. I worked the bar, carried trays of drinks, plated finger foods, cleared tables, and occasionally played unofficial therapist when bridesmaids started crying in the bathroom. Most weddings followed the same pattern. Ceremony in the garden, formal dinner with polished silverware and carefully folded napkins, and then the evening party that usually ran until 1 in the morning. With open bars, people drank more than they intended. That was standard. Unless someone was falling over or clearly unsafe, we generally didn't get involved when they grabbed their car keys at the end of the night. Sometimes we'd help arrange taxis, but if guests insisted they were fine, management usually let it go. It wasn't ideal, but it was the unspoken rhythm of the place. Then came the wedding that still makes me smile. The groom was fresh out of an elite university. The bride came from a similar orbit, and the guest list was stacked with fellow graduates and friends who all seemed to have stepped straight out of a networking event. The families left fairly early after the formalities, leaving behind a crowd of young, very wealthy, very drunk adults who clearly believed the estate was now their personal playground. At first it was just loud laughter and sloppy dancing. Then it shifted. They started snapping their fingers at staff. One guy leaned across the bar and said, "Make it stronger. I'm not paying for water." A woman in a designer dress told one of our servers she was wasting her degree carrying trays, which was ironic because most of us were students working part-time. As the alcohol kept flowing, so did the arrogance. A group of them wandered into the hallways and started taking selfies in front of the old portraits. Someone thought it would be hilarious to draw mustaches and exaggerated anatomy on a couple of the antique paintings with a marker. One of the groomsmen climbed behind the bar and tried to mix his own drinks while shouting, "We rented the place, it's basically ours." They even attempted to push into the kitchen at one point, laughing and insisting they wanted to see how the magic happens. Our head chef, who was built like a retired boxer and held a carving knife with unsettling confidence, stepped forward and said very calmly, "You don't." They backed out. Our manager, Thomas, spoke to the bride and groom more than once. I overheard parts of it. "You need to get your guests under control," he said firmly. One of the groom's friends chimed in instead, "Relax, we can cover whatever damages. Our parents will write a check. You can't touch us." That line stuck. You can't touch us. Thomas nodded, very polite, very composed. "Of course," he said. "Enjoy the evening." That's the sentence they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Not the champagne, not the dancing, not the fancy venue, just those 4 words spoken with the confidence of people who had never been tested. Thomas didn't argue, he just nodded and let them believe it. Back in the staff area, the mood had shifted from stressed to quietly furious. We were scrubbing marker off guilt frames while dodging insults about our career choices. One of the bartenders muttered, "I hope they all have to Uber." That's when Thomas stepped outside and made a call. He didn't call about vandalism. He didn't call about trespassing in the kitchen. He called to report that there was a large event with heavy alcohol consumption and that most of the guests had arrived by car and would be leaving shortly after 1 in the morning. He provided the exact location and the only road out of the estate. By the time the party finally wound down, the guests were staggering toward the parking area, laughing too loudly and arguing about after parties. We closed up the doors, and once everything inside was secured, a few of us slipped out through a side path that cut through the woods toward the main gate. From there, we could see the road and the flashing blue lights. Police cars were lined discreetly just beyond the estate entrance, waiting. Officers stood by with breathalyzers and backup vehicles. It wasn't chaotic, it was organized. One by one, the wedding guests' cars rolled down the drive, gravel crunching under tires. One by one, they were flagged down, windows lowered, tests administered, doors opened, keys confiscated. A few drivers passed and were waved on. Most were not so lucky. We watched in near silence as groups of very well-dressed, very offended young professionals were guided into police vehicles. Their cars were driven off and parked out of sight behind the station lot so there wouldn't be a line of luxury sedans drawing attention. The estate closed the following week for scheduled renovations. In reality, we were repairing the damage from the party and enjoying the unexpected peace and quiet. I never learned the full aftermath. I do know that out of roughly 80 guests, only a handful passed the alcohol test. The rest spent part of their night at the station and had to wait days before retrieving their cars. I can't imagine that conversation with their influential parents was pleasant. What I do remember clearly is standing in that forest with my coworkers, watching the final car get pulled over and feeling a kind of calm satisfaction settle over all of us. No shouting, no confrontation, just consequences delivered efficiently. For a group that insisted they were untouchable, they discovered very quickly that rental agreements don't override traffic laws. And while we still had marker stains to clean and glasses to polish, the thought of them explaining DUI charges at brunch the next morning made the mess a little easier to scrub. Let's talk about who really won. Story 1's weapon was literalism. The HOA demanded a leash. Blue got a leash, 3 inches of it, dragging behind him like a fashion statement. The rule didn't say you had to hold it, so he didn't. Now he's a local celebrity and the HOA is silent. Story 2's weapon was punctuality. The bank wanted strict time punches. They got them. No more early arrivals, no more unpaid prep work. Suddenly, mornings were chaos, and management had to actually ask for help and pay for it. Funny how that works. But Story 3 wins, not because the revenge was clever, though Thomas's phone call was surgical, but because of the scale. 80 guests, mostly failed, luxury cars impounded, influential parents getting awkward calls, and the venue staff watched it all from the woods, sipping the quiet satisfaction of watching karma wear a breathalyzer. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.